Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Groundwater and Well Construction 101. It's our monthly webinar for the private well class. This is our topic today. All of us who are working on this today are at the Illinois State Water Survey at the University of Illinois. Our private well class program is sponsored, funded, and supported by both RCAP, the Rural Community Assistance Partnership, and US EPA. So I guess we'll just get at it today. It is part of this national program with RCAP, and it's kind of, we're doing the online version of all of this and provide support to well owners all over the country. RCAP have staff in every state and are actually doing the in-person side of our private well program. They're there to support well owners. They also can put on workshops or work with local groups to host workshops for well owners. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but if you are interested, if you're a professional and you're interested in doing something to support the well owners in your local area, RCAP folks would be glad to partner with you, and as would we. So anyway, this webinar is part of our private well class program. We do have a 10-lesson course. This webinar is meant to follow those 10 lessons. This is not the 10-lesson class. That you can sign up for on our website at privatewellclass.org, and it's free. It sends you a PDF once a week for 10 weeks. It's basically a self-paced class that you're really on your own to go through and learn, but it's a good, gives you a good basic understanding of what it means to be a well owner, what things you need to do to take care of that and protect your family's health. We did get a bunch of questions this month from you all, which we will go through some of those at the end. But then we also, during the webinar today, you have either a chat or a question box on your GoToWebinar screen or window. You can add questions in there. We're monitoring that, and we'll make a list of those questions, and at the end we'll pull those up on the screen and go through them. Ones that we can answer, we will. The ones we can't, we might ask you to email us, and so because we have to look into some specific things. I know there were a number of questions that were asked about some very specific topics related to a state or a rule. I probably won't answer those today on the webinar. Well, I know I'm not. I prefer, and we prefer, that you contact us through our help center for those sorts of things, so we have the time to look up information and try to find the right stuff for you. And so, you know, think about these webinars, the questions that we try to answer are those that are going to benefit more people who are in attendance, not just a single individual. Okay. If you're here as a professional and you are looking for a certificate or credit through NEHA or as an Illinois LEHP, we do offer those things. The way NEHA's accreditation works, and that's for environmental health professionals, you have a 2-year credentialing cycle. You can only take this particular class once every 2 years then. So for instance, if you're just started your credentialing cycle and you take this class today, this webinar today, you wouldn't be eligible for the same webinar. It has mostly the same core content until 2 years from now. And you can see down in the corner there the dates where we've offered the same course. What's different about each webinar are the questions we answer at the end. And this is all recorded and it's all available on, it'll be on our YouTube channel. This video will be. And so one thing I always try to recommend to people is if you really want to learn more about questions people have or things that you might not have thought of about your own well, go to the webinar recordings and skip to the part where you get to the questions that we answer, because they're going to be different every month and for the most part, and you'll learn a lot based on that for sure. And as far as there are handouts in the handout tab on your GoToWebinar screen, and that's the email address to email us if you want a copy of the slide deck or if you want a certificate. This is changing. Katie can tell me if this has already changed or if it's going to change, but soon we'll have this set up so that when you register, you ask for your certificate. You won't be emailing us after, which is the way we're set up today. Okay. Quickly, we implemented this 3 or 4 months ago. I'm just gonna, this is free, and it's a way for environmental health professionals to get CEUs. But we're here to really support well owners and professionals that are trying to learn about wells, not provide CEs. That's just a side benefit. And so we do expect people to be here the entire time. We don't offer any partial credit. So if you're only here an hour because you only needed an hour for your license, you're going to get 0 from us. You really need to be here the entire time. I just want to point that out because just to make sure everybody's aware where we're coming from and why we do what we do. Yeah, we're here to try to help everyone learn more about wells so that either they take care of their own well better and understand why they need to test and all those things, or as a professional, you're giving better advice to the well owners you serve. I'm Steve Wilson. I'm a groundwater hydrologist at the State Water Survey. Katie Buckley is here. She would be taking your questions. She's a water resources outreach specialist. And Sally Dolan, senior scientific specialist, helped with the questions, and she also helps with the hotline. And same with Aaron Huggett. They both manage the hotline together, and they'll help with questions, and they also provided some support for the questions that we answered that are on slides here today, as they do every month. Okay, RCAP. So many of you may not have heard of RCAP. RCAP is a Rural Community Assistance Partnership. It's 6 regional nonprofits that together cover the entire United States and all of its territories. They have staff in every state. I know in Illinois, I believe there are 5 staff. 2 of those work on private well assessments. And so I'll talk a little bit about the assessment tool, but we developed here at the U of I, with help from 12 or 13 experts from around the country, an assessment tool that basically somebody from RCAP can come to your home, ask you a lot of questions about your well, your plumbing, when you tested, take a look at your well, find out if there's any deficiencies like your well cap isn't sealed or there's bolts missing, or maybe you have a Folgers can on top of your well. That's a bad thing. Anyway, they will go through all that with you. Consider it personalized service. It's free. And I believe there's a water test in most cases if you're interested in that. That would also be free to you. And again, that's all because this is funded by a US EPA grant. And but what it'll do is it'll help you understand more about your well and the things you need to be concerned with. I work with the regional lead in all 6 regions for the private well part of this program. They're all very knowledgeable, great folks. And so you can contact us if you're interested in an assessment, and we can get you to them, or you can contact them directly. If you go to rcap.org, there's a private well page that lists all the contacts for each of the 6 regions. So RCAP together has about 300 staff. Many of them are licensed water or wastewater operators. One of the other major functions they serve with this funding from EPA is helping communities under 10,000 people, and typically much smaller than that, under 500, with their water and wastewater efforts and maintaining compliance and some of those things. This is just the front page of the well assessment. It really, there's 18 sections to this, and so you really have to have a fair amount of wherewithal to even fill it out. So it is available on our website for anybody can download it, but you want someone who knows a lot about wells, or if you have a spring, you can use it for that too, to go through this with you, so that you understand all the stuff that's asked. I mean, there's things about backflow and your septic system and your on-site system, all kinds of different questions. It's worth taking a look at. If you're interested in having an assessment done, you can look at that in advance. And it's on our website just under privatewellclass.org/assessment, I believe. We can put that link in the chat. So it's like a sanitary survey. If you know what those are the Safe Drinking Water Act requires communities to do an inventory and basically an evaluation of their water system every 3 years. It's called a sanitary survey, and it's done by the state primacy agency in those cases. But it really is meant to look at if everything's being done properly. Are they properly protecting the water so that it's safe for the residents in those communities to drink. That's a required thing in the Safe Drinking Water Act, so every community has to do that. This assessment we're talking about is voluntary and free. It's also it's private. They're not sharing information with anyone else. It just comes back to you. It's really meant to be a way to educate you as a well owner. Every well is different, and I say that meaning either the wells drilled differently, different type of casing, different depth, was grouted differently, you name it. We find wells in hog lots. We find wells in garages. I mean, all kinds of, like I said, most wells, there's something different. The type of pipes in your home, whatever it might be. And so understanding all those specific situations is really takes experience is the bottom line. And that's why it's valuable to have someone who's willing to take the time and come out and meet with you as a well owner and go through all that with you. And it's really just for your benefit. And like I said, we developed this here at the U of I at the State Water Survey with help from a group of experts, private well experts, and it's really meant to be a tool to help a well owner understand what they can do better or differently that might help protect their water, and also encourage communication, and raise awareness of some of the issues that they might have, like if their well cap isn't sealed, or there's some other deficiency, or if it's an old dug well like the one I grew up on, which I'll show a picture of later today, which was completely unsafe, is the bottom line. They've done over 3,800 of these around the country, which is really a great thing, and that's a lot of folks. Just like we've had nearly 13,000 people take our class, the private well class itself, the one you sign up for with your email. But there's just going to choke on that. There's 18 million private wells in use in the United States. So when you think about that, we're not even at 0.1% yet of homes with wells for the people that have taken our private well class. So a long way to go. Same way with the assessments. 3,800 is great. It's a pretty detailed thing, and it takes a significant amount of time for the person from RCAP, but they're really worthwhile. And even some states ask RCAP to come out and do an assessment when they have a problem well, where someone's had water quality issues or some other issue where they may not have the bandwidth to go out and do it themselves. So again, the other part of this is RCAP can work with state, county, local health or other groups to put on workshops, some of those things. And again, we can certainly give you their contact information. I know the folks working in Illinois just did a workshop with one of our county health departments on best practices for wells. So yeah, it's a pretty cool program from the standpoint of the value that goes out to the recipients, so to speak. And lastly, we're at the State Water Survey, which, Illinois is really the only state with a water survey in the country. It's one of the scientific surveys. We're a sister agency to our State Geological Survey and State Natural History Survey. Those almost every state has. But we were formed by our state legislature in 1895, really because of cholera and typhoid outbreaks and beginning to understand the relationship with water. And so that's one of the first things the Water Survey did. So we have 130 years this year, history. You go through our files, you find a lot of cool pictures like this about things in the early days and how wells were drilled, and well construction, how it's changed over time, even well logs. So we house the state's well logs. So today in Illinois, it's managed at the county health department level. A driller has to get a permit from the county, and then when they drill the well, they file a log with the county. Those logs come back to us. And so we have about 400 or 500,000 well logs in our files that date back. This is one of the older ones. So it turns out Community Conservation Corps that was formed after the Depression in the 30s to get people back to work. One of the things Illinois did was hire young men to go out and inventory wells. So this is one of those inventories, and it's a well log today in our files, but it's near Rushville, Illinois in Schuyler County. The person who owned the well said the well was installed about 60 years ago. It's 135 feet deep, and it was hand dug. So if you understand a hand dug well, I grew up on a hand dug well. My grandpa dug in 1933 that's about 4-foot diameter with uncemented brick around it, and it's only 14 feet deep because of the water availability there. To hand dig a well 135 feet, somebody had to go down in there and actually do that. I can't imagine today that would, it's just crazy. And they stopped because of a cedar stump, which is one thing. And the pump is 2 buckets and a chain. And it's interesting. So this is so 60 years ago, and this is from 1934. So that puts it back in the 1860s when this was done. And the young man who was actually doing these inventories drew a nice map of where it's at. Also, this is the deepest hand dug well so far encountered in Schuyler County, and the water's at 60 feet. There's a lot of questions here for me. They had a pump, they took it out, which would have been a hand pump, but the kind with the handle, and they found that it was too much work pumping that to get it to lift it that far, so buckets were easier. So cool history. This is a well drilled for the U of I in the 20s. If you're a well driller and you're looking at this, look at all those rivets and all the welds for the spacers. This is for every 10 feet of pipe. Today, things are much more streamlined. A driller can drill a home well in a day. This probably took, I would guess, after the hole was drilled, just installing the well took probably a better part or more of a week to do all of this work. Yeah, and I will move on. So as a well owner, these are the things that really matter. Private wells aren't regulated like community water supplies are. So, we have groundwater for our water in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, where the university is. It's Illinois American Water. They have wells west of town. Those wells are regulated. They have to test. They have to be installed a certain way. They have to treat the water to make sure it's safe, and it makes it through the distribution system to get to my house. I live in town now, so that it's still safe to drink. You're responsible for that as a well owner. There are no rules. And once a well is installed, so it's been properly installed based on the well construction code for Illinois, a well owner in Illinois is on their own. They can drink the water no matter what it's got in it if they want. But to make sure it's safe, then you need to understand that it's your responsibility to have it tested, to make sure that things are working the way they should be, that you understand where your water's coming from, if there's risk of contamination from the surface, all those things. And the one thing to remember is, you hear all the time about, my water looks, tastes. It could be the taste, look the best, taste the best, and very well could be the safest water in the world. But there are contaminants that are odorless, colorless, and have no taste. Arsenic being one of those. And I've done a lot of arsenic research in my job here over my 30 years here. And we have an area in Illinois where it's a sand and gravel aquifer, buried, confined aquifer, where arsenic can be as much as 300 or 400 parts per billion. The Safe Drinking Water Act requires communities to keep their water at below 10 parts per billion for arsenic. Now, in that area, it's Tazewell, McLean, Logan counties in that area. I've certainly run across folks who might say, my dad drank this and he lived to be 86 years old. That very well may be the case. But the question becomes, do you want to take that risk? Do you not want to know? A lot of people don't know. And no one's going to come out and tell you can't drink your water if you have a private well. And on the other hand, no one's going to be able to tell you, unless you test, that there might be something to be concerned about. Because you can certainly treat for arsenic if you have it. It's not that big of a deal. And so today, my water bill, I keep changing this number. Now it's $70 to $90 a month. My daughter's a teenager, and so in all honesty, I just yelled at her last night that she's been in the shower too long. So our water bill used to be $40 to $60. It is never anywhere near that today. But that's the cost that I pay along with every other customer, the 150,000 residents of Champaign-Urbana, for the sampling that the Illinois American Water does, maintaining all the water lines and all the distribution lines and the pumps and the water treatment plant and all those things, all of their infrastructure. And having a licensed drillers and following all the rules in the Safe Drinking Water Act, so that the water coming out of my tap always is there, always has pressure, and it's always safe to drink. And so again, as a well owner, those are your responsibility, and that's what we're here to help you understand. So really some of the basic things that are important and what you need to be aware of are things about your well and your well log. So knowing where your water is coming from. Is it a shallow well in sand and gravel? Is it a deep well, either in sand and gravel or bedrock? Where's your pump set? Is your pump above ground or down in the well? Do you have a well screen? If it's sand and gravel, you have a well screen. If it's a bedrock well, likely not. Knowing if there are any naturally occurring contaminants. You know, if somebody calls us in Illinois asking about, do I need to test my well or anything in particular? We can tell them what we know, and we do have some maps of the state for certain contaminants, and so we know where there's elevated levels of arsenic, for instance. The State Geological Survey or the USGS or your Water Resources Agency in your state, whether that be a DEQ, a DNR, a DEC, Environmental Conservation, or Department of Public Health. One of those groups will have that information and those answers for you. And the goal of our program is to help you understand just enough so that when you do have questions, you learn which questions you need to ask, what are the right questions, and where are your local sources of information. One of the things that's really important to get across to a well owner is that some people don't want to call like their local health department because they're worried about the rules. In 99% of the country, the health department has no jurisdiction to tell you can't drink your water or to condemn your well. And I used to be able to say that 100%. These days, though, there's a few local jurisdictions. I believe there's one in Massachusetts and maybe one in Connecticut I know of where they actually do have that authority. And so you can always ask that first. But in most of the country, they might recommend you don't drink your water. I ran across a home over in Tazewell County. They had 6 kids. Their arsenic level was, I don't know, 85 parts per billion. And I suggested they call their county health department and ask them what they should do. And so they did. And of course, the health department's telling them they really shouldn't drink it unless they treat it. They chose just to keep drinking it. And, you know, that's their choice. And I think it's unfortunate, especially exposing their kids for, 18 years. But that's the way it is. And it's a personal choice. And lastly, why you should sample your well and know what your water quality is. You may find out it's perfectly fine. That happens in a lot of cases, and that's great. But if it's the other thing, you want to know. I've had several conversations with older folks that live in the country. One in particular I will never forget because he found out he's got cancer, and it's terminal, and it's too late to do anything about it. And he's mad. He wants to find out if it's pesticides that may have gotten his shallow dug well, and it's way too late then, right? And so that's why it's good to know what you're drinking. So today, groundwater and wells is really has a geology bent to it here. It's to help you understand the difference in well types. You need to understand where your water's coming from. So a porous system is like a sand and gravel. So we have sand and gravel aquifers in Illinois. There's sand and gravel aquifers in most states along rivers, around the bottoms. In unglaciated parts of the country, that's the only place you'd have sand and gravel aquifers, but they're very prolific. And that's because they have a lot of porosity. So the porosity is the space between the grains. And if you look at the diagram with the yellow grains there, if it's full of water, if it's an aquifer full of water, then all of that airspace it's got water in it. So for instance, if I have a jar of sand and we take this to our state fair and we work with 4-H kids, we just ask them, so how much of this do you think is air? Well, a uniform sand could be as much as 30% air, which means if I have 100-foot thick sand and gravel that's completely saturated, if I took all the sand away, I'd still have 30 feet of water. That's a lot of water. And so that's why you see irrigation systems a lot of times that are in these alluvial bottoms, partly because it's sandy at the surface too, but also there's enough water available that they can pump, 1,500, 2,000 gallons a minute, and the well can sustain it. And so, the amount of pore space available and the porosity really dictates how much water would be in a given geologic unit that's serving as an aquifer. Fractured systems are bedrock. So if you have a piece of granite or a piece of rock, water's not running through that, right? Like it does through the sand grains. It's running between the pieces of rock and the cracks and the fissures. And so it's almost like pipe flow. And so when you drill a well into bedrock, you're trying to hit those fractures, because if you don't hit any fractures, you're not going to have any water. And that's just that simple. And so you could have two wells within, several hundred yards of each other where there's a bedrock aquifer. One might produce 1,000 gallons a minute, and one might only produce 20 gallons a minute because it didn't hit any major fractures that are connected and allow water to flow to the well once you start pumping. So it really is dependent. And I know, when you start talking about granite and like in the Rockies, many of those wells are very low flow. Granite's fairly hard. It doesn't have a lot of cracks in it. So you may, I know I've worked with a gentleman on the Western Slope who his well only pumped a half gallon a minute to not have the water level drop below the pump. And so he put in a big cistern, and he just basically runs it all the time. And then he pumps from a cistern into his house so that he has water when he needs it. Again, just looking at the differences in types of rock, sand can be well sorted or poorly sorted. Those are the pictures at the top. And so that also poorly sorted sand will have a little bit less porosity, and water can't flow through it quite as easily as consolidated material, which here is bedrock. The number of fractures and caverns like limestone. If you're talking about Southern Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, where you have Mammoth Cave and a lot of caves and karst topography, water has eroded those channels into large caves that are full of water. And that's great from the standpoint of having enough water available, but it also causes sinkholes at the surface and direct conduits from the surface down into the aquifer. And so we see those areas as having higher than normal contamination because of their link to the surface. But again, it's also provides a lot of water and a lot of movement of water to a well. The other piece besides porosity is permeability. And permeability, you can think of it as a velocity. It's not quite that, but for all practical purposes, you can consider it that way. And so the ability of water to move through the material and the velocity it can move dictates how much water will be available to your well. So in this example here, gravel is highly permeable. So water can move through a sand and gravel naturally as much as 300 to 3,000 feet in a day, because there's no resistance to movement really. There are large areas between the sand grains if it's gravel, right, or cobbles or whatever. Then as the particles start to get smaller, the permeability starts to drop. And so if it's a finer sand, it's going to be a little less permeable than a much larger sand. And then you get down to silt and clay, they're not considered aquifers. They're really considered aquatards or aquicludes, and that's because water moves through them pretty slowly. So like the clay at the bottom, this says 1 foot in 10,000 years to 0.1 foot a year. Either way, when you're pumping a well, you need water to be available right then. And so, clay and a silt prevent water moving very fast just because the grains are so small. And what's interesting is this clay could have the same porosity as that sand, the 30%, but because everything's so tiny, water molecules just can't move through that freely. So, and that's on the left side is all the unconsolidated material, and on the right side is all the bedrocks. So limestone and sandstone are typically more permeable, clearly not as much as the sand and gravel, but they still can provide a lot of water, partly because the fractures can be large, and if they do, they hold a lot of water. And so when you get down into the tighter the tighter types of bedrock like shale or extremely impermeable rock would be like granite, 1 foot in 100,000 years. So basically water can eventually find its way through, but it's really not moving, right? I mean, that's pretty slow. Matter of fact, age dating of groundwater and an aquifer to determine how quickly they recharge, They use tritium, because tritium was never introduced into the atmosphere until the first nuclear bomb tests. And so if it's in an aquifer, then we know that water's been recharged since the 50s, as one measure, for instance. So, so permeability and porosity are the two real things that dictate the amount of water that's available in an aquifer and how fast it can move through an aquifer. And both of those things are important to how fast water can get in your well when you start pumping water out of your well. Because if water can't get in, then the water level is just going to drop until you've pumped what's in the well volume, and it won't. Then your pump will, will break suction and it won't pump anymore because there's no water in the well. And so you need that recharge going to your well. And we'll talk about that drawdown and some of those things here in a little bit. So these are just kind of some basic examples. If I had a horse trough that was full of each of these materials and I poured water at the top evenly, you can see the wetting front on the sand and gravel as it's moving down through the sand. If it's on the upper right, the dolomite, it's usually fractured. This is an idealized version, obviously, because it's showing that everything is like bricks, but it's a good indicator of what can happen. Crystalline bedrock is your granite. And again, typically the porosity of granite is less than 1%. So you're really hopeful. Sometimes you see some really deep wells that don't pump much water. And then, in the real world, this is the sandstone and dolomite. There could be shales in the middle of that too, and it's slanted. None of these geologic layers are flat. There's a lot of complications in the real world, if you will. And so this is from Iowa's Department of Natural Resources. We actually modified this and created this version, but it really shows if you're in a glaciated area like in Iowa or Illinois, what you run into. And so at the surface, there's some glacial sands, and there's a water table, which is where when you start digging down into the ground, it's where the soil becomes saturated. It doesn't mean it's an aquifer. It could be clay, but it just means that's where water's infiltrated and it's formed a free surface, if you will. All the pore spaces are filled with water. And in here they're showing some aquifers, small aquifers that are the darker color that are wet, and a couple wells up at the top. And then there's a deep well in the middle that goes through all the way through the unconsolidated material that's a confining layer, the glacial drift, through a limestone, a shale, and another limestone down into sandstone. So this well doesn't have a casing all the way down into that sandstone. It stops somewhere probably in the limestone near the top. And that's because to take advantage of a fracture, you have to have a way for the water to get in the well. If you have a solid casing like you would in the sand and gravel well that has a screen at the bottom, you wouldn't take advantage of those fractures. And I'll explain that a little more in a minute, show a diagram, but you don't know what you're going to find. In this case, there's shallow sands along the river. There's a limestone and then another limestone and a sandstone, all of which are likely aquifers. There's a pretty thick confining layer shale. That thickness varies over space. And so there may be places where it pinches out, and that's where the deeper aquifers are being recharged. But this is a really good diagram to show, how complicated the geology can be. And, in areas where there's a really good thick sand and gravel, like where we're at in Champaign-Urbana, we have about 400 feet of material over bedrock, and about 200 feet of that is an aquifer. 200 feet of sand provides more water than any of us could use individually, for sure. There's very few wells drilled into the bedrock here, even though there's bedrock aquifers further below. Why would you drill, a 1,000-foot well or a 600-foot well when you can drill a 200-foot well and have plenty of water that's of a potable water quality? So this is getting to how long things are in the ground. And this is a really good representation of the water cycle. So we're not showing all the above ground stuff here, where it rains, it runs off into a stream, that runs off to the ocean, eventually evaporates, and it rains again. We're looking at the part that's just going in the ground and infiltrating. So once it makes its way down to the water table, it's seeped into the ground from the surface. Depending on where it's at on the landscape and the type of material, the geologic material, all of those dashed lines are flow lines. So if it makes its way down to the very deep aquifer, again, it can be centuries or millennia before that water eventually makes its way back to that river. But it will eventually. It's a cycle. So water's always coming into an aquifer, so it has to leave, right? You only have a certain volume. You can't keep putting water in if it's completely saturated and not have water leave. And so when the water levels are different in different parts of the aquifer, it pushes it towards the lower end. You know, it's a pressure thing. Water wants to be flat. If you look at the water in your bathtub, it's completely flat until you pull the plug on the drain. Then that's the low spot and all the water runs towards it because water's trying to always be flat, if you will. And so that's what happens in an aquifer. You're putting water in over on the left side, it's making its way down to the deep aquifer. That's kind of pushing water out towards the drain, if you will, which in this case is a river. And water does flow vertically up if the pressure's right. So it's no different than if I have a juice box with a straw in it and I decide to squeeze it. Where it's going to happen, water's going to go up the straw instead of, right? It's the same concept. It's pressure. It's the pressure you're applying on the system. So as far as aquifers and wells, you know, you may have choices. Really, your geology determines what you have available. A dug and bored well is a large diameter well, kind of like a cistern, if you know what that is. But it's meant, it's drilled, it's installed so big so that it can store water because water can only get into it slowly. So like the well I grew up on was 3 or 4 foot diameter. It took water from the water table, from that clay, but it slowly seeps into the well. And so you have enough volume there that, it stores up when you're not using it. But you don't have a real aquifer that'll provide water to a well continuously with a pump. And so you may have to put in a dug or bored well. If you have sand and gravel aquifers, you can have a sand and gravel well that's usually drilled or driven. And then if not, and you have to go to bedrock, then in some cases bedrock's at the surface, so that's your choice. But then consolidated rock is a drilled into those different types of material we just talked about. And again, where I'm at in Champaign County, Illinois, we have 2 sand and gravel aquifers that are separated by clay, and then bedrock that could also serve as an aquifer. In other places you might not have any, and you're putting in, you know, we have areas in Illinois where everyone has a dug or bored well because there's no real aquifer to put a well into. And understanding that geology is, you know, the first thing to understand based on where you live and where your well is. They can all be different. So dug or bored wells can take many forms. An old hand dug well, like the one on the upper left, they've covered it with some 2x10s and then pieces of tin and concrete and rocks to keep it covered. This is about a 6 foot diameter well that was hand dug. You see the electric box there for the pump. Those posts look worn. That's because that's a cattle pasture. And so the cows are coming up there, scratching. I use those posts to scratch, and they're also doing their business right next to the well, which is seeping into the ground. You can see the mud kind of on the right side there, right in front of the well. That's from the cows. And so 2 feet below land surface, water can seep into this well because it's uncemented brick, very unsafe, very likely it's always going to have bacteria. And not only, you know, from the cows, but rats, mice, frogs, toads, all those who can probably get in this if all those boards aren't placed perfectly and you're not being careful. And we see a lot of wells like this still in use. So bored wells are bored by a drilling machine. So the one on the right is where they've put in the 3 foot diameter, drilled a 3.5 foot diameter hole. Then they use vertical tile. So like the tile that goes under a culvert on your road, you put it vertically, you just set it on, there's a male and a female in, they set it up against each other, and you just string those up to the surface depending on how deep you went, and water can get in at the seams in those 4 foot sections. And the one on the bottom left is really just like the bored well on the right, except that that lid is 10 feet below land surface, and this casing goes down into a hole in that lid, and that's just meant to help be more protective of surface infiltration. And I'll show you the diagram of those here. The one on the left is the one that has the concrete pad at the surface. You can see the 4-foot sections. You can see where the water level is in the well. This has a submersible pump in it, and water seeping in from all of those sand lenses and all of the fine textured soil, it says there, because it's not really an aquifer, but there is water in it. It's got a water table, and it'll slowly seep in, and you're storing enough water here because of the diameter that you might use part of this in the morning or part in the evening with showers and laundry and things, but then it seeps back in and tries to match the water table that's on the outside of the well bore, overnight or during the day when there's no pumpage going on. And the one on the right is the one that had a standard well cap that in the picture we just showed. And here again, it's still got the concrete pad. It's just down at 10 feet. They put clean earth fill that's fine, and it'll help from water running down along the sides or getting into the well closer, higher than 10 feet. And this is code in Illinois. You have to, if you put in a bored well, you got to have this 10 foot of concrete or some type of material that doesn't promote water flow through it. So, yeah. And we just have areas in Illinois where they don't have a choice. Christian County, Edgar County, Sangamon County, there's areas where all the homes in the country, if you will, have bored or dug wells. Sand and gravel wells, what's unique about a sand and gravel well is it's a solid casing down into the sand and gravel aquifer, and then there's a well screen. And the screen, you can see a picture of it here. The size of the spaces between those, it's stainless steel woven wire basically, and the slot size for the screen, which is what that's the open space between those is called, is really based on the size of the sand grains. So when you think about how this was all deposited, the sand and gravel was all deposited in Illinois anyway, or along a river bottom, it's from running water. So the biggest particles fall out first, then finer and finer as the water slows down. So what you typically see is you see the largest, coarsest material at the bottom of a sand and gravel aquifer and the finest at the top. And so what a driller will typically do is, you don't want to put it in the fine sand because it's more likely to get through the screen, even if you're using a smaller slot size, and you don't want to pump sand that's really hard on your pump and your pipes and everything else. So they'll drill down, and they're taking samples as they go, and they'll find a spot in the aquifer where it's more coarse, maybe some pea gravel size material along with some larger sand, and that's where they'll finish the well and put the screen. And they also put, you can see on this diagram, it says gravel pack, third from the bottom. You also put a uniform size sand that, you buy it. It's, we put in monitoring wells, we buy them in bags, and that goes around the screen. It helps keep finer materials from getting through. It's just large enough not to go through the screen itself, and helps prevent, having other fines get in through the screen. But the important thing here is if this is a 200-foot well, there's usually a 4 or 5 foot screen at the bottom, and this well's typically 4 to 6 inches in diameter. All of the water's coming in the well at 195 to 200 feet for a 200-foot well. The last 5 feet. Everything else is solid pipe. You put grout around the outside, which is, you put grout around the well to seal the outside of the well from having water go around down the outside, especially because the hole you've drilled is bigger than the well casing, right? Or you couldn't get it in there. And so you fill up that space between the two, which is called the annulus, with fine material or concrete that won't let water flow along the well outside of the casing. And so you're protected from any kind of surface influence. So, so that's typically how a sand and gravel well is installed. This is a well log for Illinois. This was done obviously with some software because it's all typed really nice. And so the things to point out here, if you go to the bottom right, 24 says earth materials pass through. So this is a geologic log of this particular well. And so they hit sand, they hit a clay from 126 to 260. And then they hit a sand, he called it tight. That means it's finer sand. It's harder to drill through. From 260 to 285, then just sand from 285 to 290, and then sand and gravel from 290 to 295. So they're getting into the thicker material, and so that's where they place the screen. Right above that, 23, they're saying the water comes from sand and gravel. In this case, it looks like they put in a 10-foot screen. No, a 5-foot screen. Oh, it's coming from the material that's from 185 or 285 to 295. And then they did a pumping test. So the static water level before pumping was 159 feet, which if you look at there's clay from 126 to 260. So the fact that the water level came up above 260 means that that sand is completely saturated and under pressure. And the pressure the aquifer is under is what caused the water level to come up to 159. So it's basically 100 feet above the aquifer. That means it's confined, and that's artesian pressure. Okay, artesian doesn't mean it's flowing out the top. It can, but artesian just means that it's under pressure greater than atmospheric, and that's what's going on in this case. And they pumped it at 20 gallons a minute. They didn't put how many hours here, probably for 2, and it only dropped 6 feet to 165, which you'd expect with this much sand. If the aerial extent of the sand and gravel aquifer is fairly large, then water can flow through that sand really easily. You're always going to have water in the well. You're not going to see much drawdown. Above that, it shows the materials. It says, they use, I believe this is SDR as PVC, but I'm not 100% sure of that. It might be steel. Anyway, there's a 5-foot screen at the bottom, and you can see the casing's 12 inches above land surface. Anything else of interest here? So they put in a pump over number 5 on the left side. They put in a 15 gallon per minute pump. And so I did want to mention that typically whenever they drill a well, a driller will put in a pump that's larger than the one that they plan to install. And so they can really stress the well and the aquifer, just make sure that it's going to sustain the pumpage that they want. It also helps them decide where to set the pump in the well. If this would have dropped 60 feet when they pumped it, then they would have put the pump much lower than since it only dropped 6 feet. In the end, they set the pump at 186 feet, again, number 5. And, that is to account for any changes in water level during the year, which probably aren't very big, because pumpage is not going to cause water to drop in the well very much. So a lot of information on a good log. This is the good log. And we see all kinds for sure. But yeah. And they also provided this. And again, these come to us in the end. So these are all in our files. A well owner in Illinois can call us and we can look up information for a location like it. Or if they're a homeowner and they're going to put in a well, or they're buying property and want to put in a house out in the country and install a well, we can provide all of that information to them. And someone in your state probably can too, at least in most states. That information may even be online. Our state geological surveys put all of our water well logs online on a map. It's a Esri mapping tool, so you can find your location and see the depth of all your neighbors' wells, your well, all that stuff. It's all public information. So the last type of well is a bedrock well, and it's also typically drilled. But you can see here, what's different is there's only casing 10 to 20 feet into the bedrock. And that's so you can seat that into the rock and make sure you have a solid, you're connecting it basically with, what's it called? A packer. And that seals that so that into the rocks, because again, when you drill a well, the hole has to be a little bigger than the well casing that you're going to put in so that you can get the well casing in. So, as an example, if you're putting in a 6-inch well, the driller might use a 7 3/8 or 7 7/8 bit. I might have those numbers butchered, but it's going to be a larger hole. And so the difference is water's in bedrock is not coming, it's not coming from all over, it's coming from fractures. And so in this case, we show a couple small fractures and one larger fracture that are all below where the casing is. Rock is solid, so you drill a hole through rock, the hole stays put. And so what's going on here is the hole itself is the casing, and water can then run in and from those fractures. And one concern there, not necessarily, but depending on the type of bedrock and the number of fractures and how much water you have available, is if you only hit one fracture, wherever that fracture goes to, like this one here is going off the page to the right and going upward, it could go all the way near land surface. And so then you're getting water from much closer to the surface than you think. But the other difference is if this was a 200-foot well, if bedrock were at 30 feet, you might only have 50 feet of casing, which means water can get in your well from 50 feet down to 200 feet. 150 feet of that well is open to having water get in it, if you will. And that's also less protective than a well that only is getting water from 195 to 200 from like the sand and gravel example. And so understanding those things, or if you have rock at the surface, there's likely fractures that are interconnected. And when we redid this diagram, we didn't do a good job of showing interconnected fractures here, I guess. But that's that other figure showed some of that. And so it can be influenced over a larger area. That's kind of the main point, I guess. And this is a bedrock log. If you look down on the bottom right, and this is an older log, it's from 1980, so you can see there's only 18 things on this log, where the one I just showed you for sand and gravel had 24. Well, our Department of Public Health manages the well program in the state of Illinois, and over time they've made improvements, changes, had suggestions from both environmental groups and drillers groups about what should be on the log, and so it's improved over time and asked more things and has more detail that can be provided, which is really valuable to both the well owner and to folks like us when we're looking at these logs trying to determine what we want to learn about, mapping the geology or where the water level might be and how that might be affected, or how different aquifers might be interconnected. Anyway, so here we hit bedrock at 189, and then there's 68 feet of limestone and then 3 feet of shale. So when the driller hit the shale, he realized, I'm not going to get any water out of that shale, so he stopped. And so it's the limestone that's providing the water here from 189 to 257. So if you go back up to the table above that, number 15, they use PVC from the surface down to 179, and then 20 feet of black steel down to 199. So that's 10 feet into the bedrock, and they seeded it. You have to torque that packer. It's I don't think they use lead anymore, but it's a lead packer that seats that into the rock. And it's hard to do that with PVC and not crack it. So they put steel at the bottom and then connected PVC to that because it's cheaper and lighter, has a lot of advantage, especially for cost to the homeowner. And so there's only 199 feet of casing in this well, even though it goes to 260. So from 199 to 260, it's an open hole into that rock. And again, they stopped after they hit shale, realizing that that's not going to provide water. The person who filled out this log was probably in their office. And so number 12 has a mistake on it that says water from shale from 257 to 260. And the reason that happened is typically you finish the well in the unit you're going to use for a water supply. And so the person in the office just took the last value there and threw it in. And that's not the case. 17, static water level is 130. The pumping level, pumping at 25 gallons a minute for 2 hours, was 160. So water level dropped 30 feet. Again, the same thing here. The limestone doesn't start until 187 or 189, however you want to look at it, because it's really connected to the sand and boulders. But the water level is all the way up to 130. So it's under pressure. It's pushing water up into that well from somewhere else where the water levels are higher in that same unit. The only other thing here is they put the permanent pump in on number 5. was only 12 gallons per minute. So they've realized that when they pumped it for 2 hours at 25 gallons a minute, it dropped to 160. So pumping at 12 gallons a minute, it's a pretty linear thing. Setting it at 160 is safe in their opinion, and they probably put enough wells in this area that they understand it is. Even though this is for a camp, they have a 220 gallon pressure tank. So it's, it's supplying more than a home. That's why they have a 12 gallon per minute pump. A home, can get by with a much smaller, less than 5 gallon per minute pump, depending if they have any other uses, livestock or anything. So that's the difference in logs, and hopefully it's pretty clear why you need to understand what kind of well you have, where you're getting your water from, which unit, where your pump's set, all those things, and how they influence, especially when you have a problem. I know we had a question about losing water during the middle of a shower today. I'm going to answer that, but it's exactly that. Knowing where to set your pump and some of those things matter. So there's really, lots of issues related to wells that we care about, not only protecting people's health, but also protecting the aquifer, source water. That's our source water for so many things. In Illinois, it's less than half of the total water use for public consumption because all the Chicago area is on Lake Michigan. But for most of the state of Illinois, most of our communities are using groundwater. So it's important for a private well owner using the same aquifer as a community like Champaign-Urbana that they're diligent and cognizant of the potential to contaminate that unit if they're not taking care of their well. And just general water quality for a well are really the things that we're concerned about as we work with private well owners and, trying to make sure their water is safe and clean and providing that public health protection. We also see all these other issues: drought, flooding, contamination, PFAS today. It was lead, was when it first hit. Non-regulated drinking water was a term that one of the federal agencies used for private wells, because the truth is they aren't regulated once they're installed in most areas, and it's really up to the homeowner. But you talk to a lot of homeowners with wells, they want to not be regulated. So, it works both ways. But the reason I point these out, and especially the boil orders, is because these are an opportunity to reach out to well owners, or when a well owner may contact us, right? Or if you're a professional working in the industry, wells get overtopped by flooding. That's why this well it's 12 feet tall. This is right along a state highway. I saw this and decided to stop and take some pictures, because it's a great example of how you deal with not having the top of your well flooded. That tree line is actually a stream. You put it above the floodplain. So it's a pain to get a truck over that and to work on that and pull a pump, I'm sure. But you have no worries about your water being contaminated by flood water in this case. But all these issues, when they happen, I mentioned boil orders because I've had a number of small community water operators tell me that when they've had a boil order, which happens because their water main breaks typically, and they have to repair that, and anytime that happens, there's a chance for something to get in the line. So they have to have the residents boil their water until they get it fixed, and they can be sure that the water's safe to drink and doesn't have anything in it. They get calls from private well owners in the area. I heard on the radio that there's a boil order. Is that a problem for my private well? Which gets to, it's an opportunity for the water operator to explain to them why that's not the case and help them understand where their water's coming from and how it's different and all those things. And so when these things come up and we start getting calls because of something that happens, that's really an opportunity for us as professionals to educate well owners about their issues and what they should understand about their well. In the end, we see certainly many well owners who understand a lot of things about their well. We also see folks who've only been on city water, moved to a private well, and have no idea how to take care of it or what it means, or they call whenever they don't have water, not understanding that it's their responsibility to take care of it. So that's why I kind of bring this up, because it's important to be informed and understand where your water's coming from. What I found in our work, the private well class is 12 years old. I've been here 36 years working with well owners and on aquifer issues. These are the two biggest things that a affect private wells still. Poor well construction, these old wells. We still see hand dug wells. We still see piston pumps, if you know what those are, that are, some of those, they work. They also use a lot of oil, a piston pump does, and it's right on top of the well. And just lack of general knowledge about how to take care of their well from a homeowner with a well. And so that's where I think most of us can make the largest dent in raising awareness, creating a more informed well owner, getting more of the public to a point where they understand what having a private well is. We get calls all the time from people who, or talk to people who, I looked at a house with a private well, but because it had a private well, I just decided I didn't want to buy it. I really love that house, but I don't want to deal with it. Well, if you don't know what dealing with a private well really means, you're making an uninformed decision. And because in that particular case, the person who's a colleague of mine, she would have been, it would have been a good fit for their family, all those things. Understanding all that really matters. And so that's really why we're here, is to help raise that awareness, to kind of raise the overall bar of the knowledge of private well owners. So poor construction, again, huge issue. We see a lot of, especially older wells that don't meet code today, they're grandfathered in. You don't have to bring your well up to code if the code changes. You just had to meet code when the well was drilled. And so, and sometimes in some states, the code wasn't even there until as late as 2000. So every well in that state was done by someone who didn't have to meet any rules. And some certainly are very diligent and did things the right way and protective. Others just wanted to get the work done. And you have that in any profession. But we still see wells. The one thing I didn't show on the diagram is all of those diagrams had a pitless for the submersible pump, which is basically an elbow that can deattach, that turns the drop pipe you're pushing water up from your pump, that elbows at 90 degrees to go in your house down at 3 or 4 feet below land surface. And the reason you have those, especially in northern climates, is because if you brought the pipe up to the surface, it would freeze in the winter. So the solution to that before the invention of the pitless adapter in the 60s was to dig a pit, put your well in a pit, keep it covered, and so then it won't freeze. There's still pits in use today. What we tell people is, those things aren't sealed. They can fill up with water if you have a heavy rainstorm. If you don't have your cap sealed and you haven't changed your rubber gaskets, then it's not going to be watertight. And so we see those issues, wells and pits, and we also still see a lot of hand dug wells that are still in use that, probably causing, allowing surface contamination to get in those wells. And not only are they an opportunity for that, but they're also a safety hazard. So, for example, the picture on the right is a goat that fell into an old bored well or dug well, where you can see down by the goat that there's big pieces of stone. That was what lined this. And then the owner of this property, this well was not in use, put a piece of concrete tile, a culvert, on near the top. It only stuck up about 12 inches above land surface. So there's a goat farm nearby. Goat got out. For some reason, it made its way into that well. And again, this particular well was not in use, but we see snakes, frogs, rats, you name it. We've seen it in wells that are in use. We actually had somebody a couple of years ago on this webinar who asked a question about her dad's well, and the water smelled funny when they went to his house. He still lived out on this farm, older, a lot older. And when they opened the well, there were snakes running around. They could see them moving down in there, and that's the water he'd been drinking. The picture on the left here is from the Washington State Department of Ecology. They are the agency in Washington State that manages well drillers and their licenses and well construction. And they had a blog for a while, and this is probably from 2013 or 2014 when we first started. where this is a little well house. There was a plywood over the top of this. I'm sure the woman who lived there had stepped on that 100 times. This time it broke and she fell and it killed her. But when you look at this building, there's a little funnel there that's probably for oil right next to the well. There's all that gray stuff, which is probably insulation for the well casing or for the well house. All of that is going right into the well. And their well is just an old, big corrugated tile or pipe. Not the way to do things. Okay, so what should you do? You need to bring these up to code if you can. And obviously, in some cases, that's a bigger job than others. And obviously, money is always an issue. But if there's a way to do that, especially a well in a pit, you just need to extend the pipe to the surface, put in a pitless adapter. And that's something a contractor can do, and fill it in with clay grout so that you don't have that issue anymore. And you can talk to your county health department or local health district. You can talk to extension, a contractor, or whoever your well authority is in your state. They may be able to give you some good advice and let you know who's in the area. Most of the National Groundwater Association, they represent a lot of groundwater professionals, including me as a scientist and engineer, but their drillers branch, if you will. Most states have a state affiliate, and if you contact the state affiliate, if you just say My State Drillers Association, they go by different names, but you'll find it. Most of them have a list of drillers, and you can find someone who's reputable that way. But yeah, you want to fix that if you can, just because it is a risk, especially if your well is in a pit and the cap's down in the pit, and like I said, a heavy rainstorm that's going to fill up. Same with abandoned wells. So because well logs weren't required in most states until at least the 60s, and in a few states it might be before that. I just talked to someone, trying to remember what state that was now. I think it was Oklahoma, where they actually required, it's Colorado. They actually were requiring some of this in the 50s. Illinois is 1968, New York it was 2000, but because of that, most people still had wells before that. They just weren't putting logs on file. And so there's a lot more wells out there that we don't know about than wells that we do. And, I know in Illinois, we estimate there's probably as many abandoned unsealed wells as there are wells in use. And they're just a safety hazard. And they're also a potential source of contamination, depending on if they tap an aquifer. And people see those, like a big culvert sitting there, and they may decide that's a great place to throw stuff, old cans or whatever. We've certainly seen that. And so, what's important is that if you have an unused well on your property, it's important that you properly abandon and seal it. And most state well codes have instructions for how to do that. And some may require that you even contact the local health district so they can come out. But it's important that you're not responsible. If someone goes on your property, even if they're not invited, and they fall into an old well and they get hurt or worse, you very well could be liable. And if you contaminate an aquifer because you've left that open, you may affect your neighbor's well or a bunch of neighbors' wells or community water supply. And that would eventually get worked out, and you would be liable for that. Just some more examples. These are 2 abandoned wells. The pictures, again, are from the Washington State Department of Ecology. All the newspaper clippings are from the 90s. Illinois used to have a groundwater education coordinator, and he gave me these when that position was eliminated. But the third one down made national news. It was covered on CNN. 18-month-old Jessica McClure fell in a well in Texas, and they covered it live. It was over a day. I know she was in that well. She's a mother of 3 today. But, a lot of people weren't that fortunate. Before the internet, people didn't know these things happen as often as they do. These are just, the other 3 are all from Illinois, where someone either was pulled from a well or somebody died from an old well. And these 2 pictures here, one, they're pulling a horse out of a well. It fell in this well that's just in a pasture somewhere. And the Sheldon man in Washington, he was walking in his backyard and didn't know the well was there. And I fell 45 feet. They pulled him out and he walked away. Super lucky. We just had that happen here in Illinois, just an hour south of here. Someone called us. They said they were mowing their yard, and all of a sudden their riding mower, kind of dipped, and they could tell there was a hole there under the sod. And so a colleague and I went down there, and we brought a camera with us so we could camera it if it was going to be a well and see how deep it was and stuff. And it turned out it was just an old dug well in the front yard that was only 12 foot deep. But it was big enough that if she would have ran across that in a different way, she probably would have been down in there with her riding mower. And so, yeah, and this was 2 years ago. So these things just happen. Okay, the difference between aquifers and aquatards. I mentioned it already. So it's a geologic unit, right, that's saturated with water, and it will yield enough water to a well. And we're going to get into the weeds a little bit because it's funny how different people view the word aquifer in different ways. So if it only pumps 30 gallons a minute, a community wouldn't consider it for a water supply, but a home could. And so is that still an aquifer? To me it is, but it still yields enough water for potable use. But some people would say then no, it's not, because they want it for community use or for irrigation and it won't pump that much water. Where an aquitard doesn't yield an appreciable amount of water, which I already mentioned: clay, silts, rock that's not very fractured, where you can't get much water out of it, it doesn't hold much. Again, it comes back to porosity and permeability. It's not only got to have a volume of water there, the porosity side, it's got to have a way for the water to move to the well, which is the permeability side. And that's the difference here. And so again, different users might call them different things. As far as confined and unconfined, an unconfined aquifer has a free surface. So if you have sand right at the surface, like near a large river, a lot of the areas, those bottom grounds are all sandy. You go down 3 or 4 feet, you hit the water table. That's also the aquifer surface, because it's just sand down to where it gets saturated. And that's the upper surface of that's called the water table and the uppermost unit. But you can be in a clayey area where it's clay for 50 feet and then you hit sand and gravel. You could still have a water table. If you start digging, you're going to reach a spot where the clay is completely saturated. That's the water table, but it's not any source of water for a well. It's just, that's where the geologic material, the sand silt clay, if you will, and is saturated because of infiltration. So an unconfined aquifer has a free surface, which means at where it becomes saturated, the water's at atmospheric pressure. Where in a confined aquifer, it's where it's under pressure higher than atmospheric and it's completely full. So the examples I talked about earlier, the sand and gravel well, where the aquifer didn't start till 260 feet, but the water level was at 160 feet, there's pressure on that system, it's called artesian pressure, that's pushing water up into that well an additional 100 feet or above the aquifer. And that's where it reaches an equilibrium, if you will, with the atmospheric pressure of the air. So in an unconfined aquifer, this is all sand. You have a water table. It's also the aquifer. So you have wells in it. It's got one water level. If you have a confining layer, like an aquitard, which would be a clay or a shale, then you have an unconfined aquifer above that where the water table is, in this case. It could also be, and then you could have a confined aquifer that's below the clay. So the water level in the confined aquifer is the dashed line, and the water level in the water table aquifer, the unconfined aquifer, is the solid line with the little arrow. Because the water level in the unconfined aquifer is higher than the water level in the confined aquifer, there's pressure pushing down on the system to push water through the confining layer. And very slowly, not a lot, there's recharge going through the aquitard into the confined aquifer because of the difference in pressure. It's like if I pour water on a table and I lift up one end of the table, it all runs down the other end. Again, it's trying to find a lower pressure. So here, this is confined. The water level is above the aquifer, and those hashed lines are really meant to be the confining layers, so the clay or the shale between the aquifer on both sides. So it's confined where water can't move as freely. And then you have a water table that's higher up there in this example. You can have it the other way, where it turns out the water level in the aquifer, because of pressure, is higher than the water table. In that case, water would be trying to go through the aquitard above into the other material. And if it's flowing, just because the land surface may be low there or whatever, that's still the same thing. It's under pressure, it's an artesian well. This one just happens to be flowing. And here's a good example of that. So again, this is from Iowa Department of Natural Resources. We've modified this and created this version. But you have a multi-unit area where you have bedrock at the bottom, and then a confined aquifer, then a confining layer, and then an unconfined aquifer and a water table. So the water table well, you can see the blue in the well where the water level is. And remember I mentioned that typically geology is not flat. It's at an angle, especially rock, but it can vary over space and time, the elevation. We have the aquifer that's used in the Chicago area, the deep sandstone aquifer wells are 1,500 feet deep. 50 miles west, that same unit is at land surface. So it does vary, and that's why that area west of Chicago acts as a recharge area, because it's putting water in because it's accessible, if you will. So in this model, we have recharge coming in from the right, where the aquifer comes to the surface, and it's causing the water level to be higher in the aquifer. And the water levels are fairly consistent over space because it's pressure related, and if it can move freely through the aquifer, then that pressure transmits quickly. And so we have one well that's artesian on the far right that still has the elevation is such that the water level is above the aquifer, but it's not flowing. But then further down in the landscape by the stream, if that well weren't flowing and causing that dip in the dashed line, the potentiometric surface, which is the water level in the confined aquifer, would be a straight line or close to it over a short distance. And so that's how you get flowing artesian wells. It's because somewhere else off to the left or right or forward or back, the aquifer is at a different elevation. There's water recharging that causes the water levels in that area to be higher. And so the water's pushing through trying to be level. And yeah, that's how that all works. I mentioned the Chicago area. This doesn't go 50 miles, but the blue on this is Lake Michigan, and these are wells in I said the deep sandstone. It's either the St. Peter, the Ironton Galesville sandstones. Those arrows indicate direction of water flow. And so even though the sandstones are tilted from down to the right, water is flowing from the bottom right up to the upper left because they've pumped enough between Geneva and Elmhurst to lower water levels lower than they are right by Lake Michigan, where they've stopped using groundwater for the most part, and now they use Lake Michigan water, so the water levels have recovered in the sandstone. So the cone of depression caused by pumpage further west of Chicago has caused water to flow towards that cone of depression. And that's so you've seen it flowing in two directions. And if this went further left, west, you would eventually get to, I mentioned 50 miles west, the St. Pete would be close or at the surface. So it's all driven by pressure. It can flow uphill. It's pretty neat. So this is what this looks like. I mentioned drawdown and cone of depression. So the picture on top is like a cross section sliced through it. So you're seeing a well. The arrow means we're pumping water out, and that's lowered the water level. So the darker blue is where the water level is. The light blue with the dashed line is where the water table was when the well wasn't pumping. So if you were to draw a elevation diagram, like, land surface elevation, a water surface elevation, which is what the bottom one is, it's like you're looking down from the top. This shows that the well itself, which is lowest, if you look at the upper diagram, is at 400 feet mean sea level, and out on the edges is at 460 feet mean sea level. So the drawdown in this case is 60 feet. We're pumping this well, we're lowering the water level in the well 60 feet, and that if it's an ideal aquifer that's similar material and has the same porosity and permeability, it's going to be idealized radially like this. It's coming from all directions. So they should be perfect circles. That's not the real world. We have finer and coarser grains. We have, geology is complicated, and sometimes there's areas where there isn't aquifer where it should be. And so it's not this perfect of a circle, but it's how it works and how the math works when you're determining drawdown and what we know about the equations of flow and drawdown and aquifer properties. So if you had two wells, this is what that would look like. They overlap. So they still, in this case, still most at the well, but a lot more of the water is coming from out or away from those two cones, or those two wells. You can also have a boundary. The sand and gravel just stops. If you look at the upper part of this, there's the edge of the aquifer. There's no more sand and gravel. So water can't transmit to the well if it's not there. And because of the boundary, you've created, it's disproportionate, and it draws it down more because it can't recharge and can't pull water from further away to keep that as the cone of depression we had before. And the opposite can happen if you're close to like a source, the river in this case. There's enough water flowing through a large river that pumpage from a well isn't going to make a dent in the water level in the actual river. And so it acts as a constant recharge source. And it's always going to be at 445 elevation. And so water's, that's why the upper one looks like it does. And so it's pretty cool the way all this works. It's pretty straightforward once you've figured this out, and it helps you understand, the amount of drawdown you have, again, is based on permeability and porosity, how quickly water can fill the well, how much volume away from the well is available to move towards the well. And if you hit a boundary or you have a continuous source, it affects how that might matter as far as drawdown. And why this matters is because one well does not work in isolation. You go to a rural subdivision, we sampled for arsenic in a rural subdivision that on a 40-acre land plot, there were 22 homes. So they're all just private wells, so they aren't pumping much water, and it was in a large sand and gravel aquifer. But if it was an area where there wasn't a lot of water available, those wells could interfere with each other. Or if a large use went in, like somebody put an irrigation pivot across the road from that subdivision, it might lower water levels in all of those wells. And so that's why understanding all this matters. I mentioned our state geological survey has our well logs online. I'm going to show an example. There are a number of states that have these, or even have better ones or more information. Wisconsin has several different viewers. One shows water quality as well. I think Washington State has a really good one. Oklahoma does, and those are the ones I've used as examples. I'm sure there are a lot of other states that also do, but for our case, this is Champaign-Urbana. The colored area is where the Muhammad Aquifer is. It's a large sand and gravel aquifer that our city gets its water from, but these are all the blue are private wells all over the area. And so if I zoom in, and click on one of those, it shows me the well depth, and the API number is the identification number the State Geological Survey uses. We use a different number, unfortunately, which is the ISWSP number, and that's because a long time ago we were separate agencies and did things differently. Most logs would have both today, and in this case, when I clicked on that dot, there's actually 3 wells here within that area. Which is why it says 2 of 3. You get some information here. This is a 269-foot well. It's right near our airport. When I look at the log, then if I click on the API number that was in blue, I should go back to that. API number in blue, you click on that, it gives you a generated log. This isn't the actual well log that the driller filed. We've entered all of the data on the log, and this is what it shows, which is the main information. It doesn't show as much information as an actual well log does, but it gives you all the geology, and that's really, especially the folks at the GeoSurvey, that was their main interest when all this was set up. But it tells you the location, who the owner was, whose farm it was, all that stuff, and a location. And these days, they also have a latitude, longitude, because the land survey system, 10-acre plot, section, quarter, township and range isn't something a lot of people use today. Some of the logs, we started this program where we actually link to a scanned image of the actual well log, and that's what these blue image viewing things are, get file from the water survey. So we're trying to link all our records together. Now we're under the same umbrella, and we're getting there. And so if you click on that, it actually shows you the original log from 1968. And this is the driller, Sims Drilling did this. This is in Champaign County. They're no longer drilling in Champaign County, but it gives you all the information that we talked about on the previous log. And in this case, they hit sand and gravel, and they stopped when they got 25 feet into it. They never went to the bottom, just because it must have been it's what they're used to drilling in. So that's groundwater and wells, basically. And so I want to talk a little bit about private well class and then get to your questions. I just want to say that if you haven't taken the 10-lesson class, you should sign up and take it. These webinars are no substitute, for sure. There's a lot more detail. It's a PDF you can save and refer to. It goes step by step through all the things that you need to understand in a way that we feel is fairly logical. We've had 13,000 people take it, and the reviews have all been, rarely do we have somebody complain. It's been fairly well accepted and vetted in the US anyway. So not only do we have the class and these webinars, but we also have a lot of other resources, which I'm going to talk about now. I need to take a drink, excuse me. Okay, this is the front page, and there's two green buttons at the top. This is going to change. We're actually switching our service to WordPress. That's going to happen sometime in the next couple of months. And so this will look a little different, but you can click on take our free class to sign up for the class, or you can visit the Help Center, which is something we launched last year. It's about a year old, that Sally and Aaron run. And, people can ask questions there. They can call us, they can email us. And so what I will say is, for some of the very specific questions that we got, that's where you want to submit those, not on a webinar, because question about a specific state and a specific rule, we're more than happy to help anyone with those, or to get you the right people. But it takes a little more effort, for one, and it's also just specific to you. And as I mentioned, that's why we have a Help Center. So if you weren't aware of it, now you are. So you go to enroll in class. I think I meant to take the slide out, because when you click on enroll in class, it takes you to this page. Really all we ask for your name, your email address, and location of state. And part of that is because we have to submit information to the folks that fund us. And one of the things that they're interested in is that we're actually helping people all over the country, not just in some places. And we certainly have. We've had people from many other countries take our class, as well as all 50 states and some of the territories, and as well as tribal nations. It's available in Spanish at this URL below. You can, if you work with folks who are native Spanish speakers, the entire class is available in Spanish. Even the figures, we've redone those in Spanish. Being at a university like the University of Illinois, where it does world-class research, one of the top engineering schools in the country, for civil at least, we're very fortunate to have students from all over the world. And so we hired a young man who was on a Fulbright scholarship from Colombia, the country, South America, who redid all of this for us because he was frustrated by how some of the translation stuff that's done, with software, how poorly it does. And so he redid the whole thing. And again, yeah, a great young man, really smart, works for a consulting firm today. Yeah, it's really helpful. For each of the lessons, like the first two lessons are called The Science of Groundwater and then Groundwater and Well Contamination. There's other resources available if you go to the resource library. If the way the private well class materials are written, they're kind of written like it's a conversation. And if that doesn't resonate with some people, they can go to these other resources and get a lot more detail. And so we've done that for all 10 lessons. And yeah, it's pretty helpful. A lot of people use them. We do webinars like the one we're on right now. Last month, it was called Outreach Strategy. It was really for professionals, not necessarily for well owners. It's about how to do outreach to well owners. And so that's, this is a blog post. You can get to our webinars from Webinars and Events as well at the top. And then our YouTube channel has all of our webinars and everything else we've done that we've recorded. We've done some specific ones on specific topics. We haven't done the funding financing ones since 23, mainly because the largest funding group for private homeowners with wells is the USDA, and they give grants to other nonprofits to provide loans, and they also do direct loans and some grants. Very financially prioritized, if you will. You have to be under a certain poverty line or certain income level. But all that's supposed to change when the Farm Bill is redone, which was supposed to be last year. And this program is going to be much different. And so we're waiting until that is all passed into law before we ask the USDA to come back and give a presentation. They helped us with this particular webinar, as well as we found other resources. Some states have programs like Iowa's Grants to Counties program, for instance. If you're in Iowa, you're very fortunate as a well owner because there's the state legislature provides funds. And so we mentioned some of those things in there. But you can get to this and see where things stand today and watch this webinar on our through our webinars and events. And then we did 2 webinars on lead in 2016 and 2018. If you have a home that's older than even 2014 for lead solder, then you're at risk. And if you're in an old farmhouse that might be from 50 years ago, it's very likely you have galvanized or lead pipes, and that the information and guidance we give hasn't changed. Dr. Kelsey Piper, who's done a lot of work looking at lead with private wells and homes on private wells with lead pipes in their home, did most of this presentation for us. And it's available again if you were interested in learning about what we know about lead and how to deal with that. We haven't done this again just because there's not a reason to. This one really gives you all the information you need. We have a lead page for this particular webinar, so you get to privatewellclass.org/lead, get to some resources. And then we also have these training videos that are on a specific topic. This one's about a shared well. I knew we had some shared wells in Illinois, but I had no idea how many people actually share wells, and it really causes a lot of problems. If it's not in the deed, or if it's not, there's not a contract, you end up with folks who are unhappy, or pump fails and one person doesn't want to pay their share for a new pump. Anyway, it's just, if you're on a shared well, there's things that you should be aware of, especially if the well is not on your property. Because many times these are handshake agreements, or it's always been this way. Somebody new buys a home, they may decide they don't want to share anymore, and they have every right just to cut you off. That's simple. Things like, why does my well keep losing pressure, or how does my pressure tank work? That video probably has close to 500,000 views, the second one I mentioned, which tells us that there's not a lot of great information about pressure tanks, and there's a lot of people in private wells that have pressure issues. which we do understand. We started a podcast in 21 called Tap Talk, the Drinking Water in Rural America podcast. We actually have 3 programs. We have this private well program that we're here today. We also have a water operator and wastewater operator program, and then we have an on-site or septic program. We interview people from all 3 areas. These are 4 talks that are actually about private wells. We've just got done with season 5, episode 60. You can get to that from our webpage. I should have put the URL here. It's just drinkingwaterpodcast.org. But we interview people who are going to provide really good advice, tell us about issues that are really important. Like Dr. Wolf is with Boston Children's Hospital, and he runs into cases where it's a difficult diagnosis and it ends up being something with a private well. Really knowledgeable guy. Yeah, it's really worth, if you like podcasts or you're interested, there's a lot of good information through that. And again, it's drinkingwaterpodcast.org. And then our help center. So you click on the button for the help center, it takes you to another site. You can call us, you can email us, you can use the chat, and the chat actually takes our materials, we put them in a database, and it gives you an answer based on our own materials, so it's consistent every time, and it's much better than, like every once in a while if you use Google and it gives you that AI answer, it can be totally off base, and that's not going to happen with this. We're here between 8:30 and 4:30 Central Time, Monday through Friday, and to take calls, or you can leave a message. But this is what that page looks like. Oh, I meant to update this. The page has changed. Now at the top where it says call us, there's also our email address. And the email address for our help center is not the same as the one I will give you at the end for this webinar. The email for the help center is help@privatewellclass.org. And you can also just search yourself. Sally's put together most of this, and Aaron's helped too, but we have about 150 or so. They're called, I guess we call them articles here, is what the software calls them. But each one is a question, is the title, and then the answer is the meat of the article. And so you can search for topics on your own. And again, we have this chat bot, you can use it and it'll give you an answer. It's pretty good. So if I say flood, it's giving me all the articles that deal with flood. If I click on the top one, is my well safe after flood? That's one of our 21 or so help videos that I mentioned. And this is the text from that, but it explains what you need to deal with and be concerned about. We have a private well conference. We had one in 2017 in Champaign, in 2019 in Harrisburg. Then we did 21 and 22 virtually because of the pandemic. We're having an in-person one. We're doing it in Bloomington, Illinois, May 20th through the 22nd. If you just go to the Private Well Class webpage and then look under webinars and events, the drop down there says the Private Well Conference. This is a conference for professionals, not well owners. We're having people come in from all over the country to talk about their programs, things they've done to reach out to well owners, tools that are available that you may not be aware of. It's actually really been well received. I know the 2 we did in person led to a lot of other collaborations between folks in different states. But if you are interested, there's no registration fee. We're able to cover all of that. You just have to get there and commit to being there and use the hotel. And so where the conference is going to be. And so if you have any questions about that or you're interested, go to privatewellclass.org/conference. You can also email us. And I'll mention now, about an hour or 2 after our webinar, you'll get an email saying, hey, thanks for attending. And it'll be from my email address. And so if you wait for that, you can just hit reply and then contact me if you're interested in more information. The agenda is on the webpage. You can see who's going to be speaking and about what. So pretty cool stuff. Yeah. This is just the first 2 pages. I thought I'd throw them up. The first thing we're going to talk about is the Hurricane Helene. The work that went on in North Carolina, and Northeastern University is in Boston, but they worked a lot in North Carolina during that and before, and then some of the issues that Tennessee had with some of the at-home testing. So yeah, it's a lot of cool stuff. There's going to be a talk on biofilms on the second day. which is really an issue that's not addressed very much. But most homes on private wells have biofilm somewhere in their system. It's just the nature of using groundwater. Unless you're treating with chlorine, which almost no one is, you're going to have that happen. Anyway, so yeah, if you want more information about our conference, you can call our helpline or email me. Sally and Aaron can certainly vouch and talk about that as well. So our program, the goal is really, in the end, we're trying to help well owners understand why their well is important, why they need to understand how it works, really also that they can help in protecting them and their family from any risk related to drinking water. And public water supplies do that by having a lot of rules in place through the Safe Drinking Water Act. Private well owners need to take that responsibility on their own. And so we're here to support all of those efforts for everyone in the country that's, all you have to do is ask, and we can provide some support. As far as the questions, as I mentioned, Katie is monitoring the question box or the chat box, if you have that, and is putting all those into a Google Doc that I'll share at the end. We did get a lot of questions. I can't remember how many, but it was probably 70 or 80. And so we can only answer maybe 8 or 10 today on the call, but you're free to reach out to us. And yeah, again, we try to not answer questions we've answered before. They're available in other ways, either through our help center and those articles or from past webinars by watching the recording. And so, and I tried to answer most of the questions that are about groundwater and wells, just because that's the topic this time. So I know there were about 10 treatment questions. I don't think I answered any of those today, just because we've answered some of those on others. There's a lot of good information already on our videos and that stuff. So how accurate would the well log be as a source for the production rate of a well? I live in the Colorado foothills where most of our water is from fractured granite, not from confined aquifers. So I showed you those logs before. It really depends on how the Colorado logs look. I mean, and there's more rules in Colorado, it's as far as who has rights to water and things like that we don't have in Illinois. Our law is just reasonable use. And so if there's something on there where the drillers are required by law to determine the production rate, then it's probably fairly accurate. It really depends on Colorado's rules. But like in our case, the driller may, he pumped it at, in the one case, he pumped it at 25 gallons a minute and it dropped 30 feet. That well obviously will produce a lot more water than 25 gallons a minute because the well was 280 feet deep, I think, or something like that. And so, it really just time and drawdown matter. And I think I included that log again here. So our bedrock well example, yeah, I did. So yeah, it's a tough question to answer without knowing Colorado's logs, but you should be able to determine if it's more like this log where they've pumped it at 25 gallons a minute. And I mean, that's not the production rate. That's just the rate so they would be sure there'd be enough water for its intended use, which in this case was a 12 gallon per minute pump for a camp. And so that's what really matters. So it's very variable. And for a home well, you don't need nearly that. But, you said not a confined aquifer. In this case, it's not about being confined or unconfined. I'd have to see the log to know if, and how deep the well is too, those things, if you want to share those. And we could also call Colorado, right, and ask about their logs and the type of information that's on them. So, because I have talked to those folks before. While taking showers, we run out of water, and after waiting, water comes back. Also, there's air in the lines. What's the cause? So, sort of described this earlier, but as you pump your well, as your pump kicks on, you fill your pressure tank. Once it's at a certain pressure, it shuts the pump off. Then as you start using water from your pressure tank, or if you have, these days, a lot of people don't have a real pressure tank. They have a 1 or 2 gallon pressure tank. and it's actually using a variable speed pump to maintain pressure in your home. So either way, whenever your pump kicks on to either maintain or keep the pressure tank at the right pressure, it's going to cause drawdown in your well. And as the water level drops, it's going to reach the level of the intake for your pump. Once that happens, it's going to start sucking air and it's going to stop pumping water because the water levels drop below that or it's right at that. And so that's definitely what's going on here. And then as you stop using it, the water starts filling back in. If this has never happened before, then it could be something like, over time, if it has a well screen, the screen's kind of gotten clogged, or there's sediment blocking something, or the inside of the intake pipe has got scale, like iron scale that happens, all those things. But I need to know a lot more about your well. And if it's a dug or bored well, then you're probably not going to be able to lower your intake. But if it's not, if it's a case like the log we just looked at, that pump set at 160, he could lower that pump 80 feet if he wanted to, and then he'd never be close if it were to start breaking suction. So it might mean, without more understanding of your well, but that's what's going on regardless. Kind of the same here. How to increase your GPM. So GPM is gallons per minute, and that's a rate. So, the very simple answer is you put a bigger pump in, you're going to get more GPMs. But I wasn't sure if that was really the issue, because if it is, a bigger pump will work as long as the well can sustain it, meaning that it doesn't cause too much drawdown and water can still get into the well at the higher rate. It means it's got to be able to get in the well. If it's pumping 25 gallons a minute and you want to pump 40, it's at 25 gallons a minute, there's enough water recovering in the well to keep it full enough to keep pumping. But at 40 gallons a minute, that may not happen. And so you have to understand those things. So I'd say install a large pump if it can sustain it. But if there's something you're trying to increase about the amount of water your well produces, putting a larger pump in is just going to make it draw down faster. And if it's not recovering and bringing water into the well fast enough, that's much more complicated because that's a well issue, not a pump issue. If it used to not do this, but it does now, it could be that if it's a screen again, it could have scale or sediment that's blocking part of it. It could be there's scale again on the inside of the drop pipe that's reduced the amount of volume that the water can come through that at the pumping rate. It's working your pump harder. We see over time, wells tend to lose production for a number of reasons. But if it's the well, then you might need to use mechanical or chemical cleaning. You can acidize a well, you can use scrapers. There's a lot of things you do. And if it's a bedrock well, if it just doesn't have the capacity, when you say fracking, their ears go up and everybody gets worried. Water fracking for water wells has been going on since the 50s or probably before that. It's just a way to use pressure to break open more fractures. And the more interconnected the fractures are, the more water you can get into your well. And so, I'm fairly sure, I've never been involved with fracking a bedrock well, but I'm fairly sure it's a fairly common practice. And so those are some things you can do if you need to actually, improve the amount of water available for your well. So how can I prevent heavy sediment and water after a storm? And I'm going to assume you mean water in your well. So what this indicates is that your well isn't properly sealed or protected from the surface. So if your water is getting cloudy, it's a huge red flag. It means that there's a pathway from the ground into your well. That means if a dog decided to poop there, that's going to get in your well. Or if somebody spilled a chemical there, it's going to get in your well. The whole point of having a properly constructed well and properly sealed well is so that what goes on at the surface doesn't affect your well. And so if that's happening, you likely have bacteria problems. I would consider testing before I drink it again for coliform. But it needs to be fixed one way or the other, unless you're willing to live with that risk, which some people do. So this well house is the well I grew up on is inside there. It's only 14 foot deep. It's in this low spot where there's a little drainage ditch to a pond because my grandpa felt that was the best place to always get water. So in a heavy storm, our water was cloudy, and you could see water running out the back of that well house underneath the concrete pad because it was running through the top of the well directly, basically. So I grew up with a well that was always contaminated, and I always had that bacteria, but my body got used to the bacteria in my well. So when I left for college and drank community well water or community water that was treated, when I came home at Christmas, our water made me sick. And so that's what I try to explain to people who well, my well may be this old well, but I never get sick. No, but have you ever had your kids or your grandkids come for a holiday and then they get back home and all of a sudden somebody's sick, they've got the stomach flu? Well, everyone just assumes it's because everybody got together on the holidays when it very well could have been the well water. And it's a real thing. And, you know, in this case, I'd recommend you have someone come out and take a look. And again, I mentioned RCAP and the assessments they do, they're completely free and they're confidential. And it's really meant to be a service to well owners. I'd be glad to get you in touch with the folks. I just need to know more information, like where you live, and I can give you the right contact. And I can just give you their contact even, and it's up to you to call them, however you want to do it. But they're worth doing. They provide a lot of good information, and they can also test your well. So, and again, that's all free of charge because of the grant we have, which is awesome. What are the most important testing or areas to inspect when purchasing a home with a well? Well, many times today, there are rules related to your lender, mortgage company, or like Fannie Mae and all of that on what you need to test for. A few states actually require testing, like New Jersey, at any property transfer. And so you have to do what they say. And there's 4 or 5 states that do that now. But I would hire a home inspector to answer your questions as far as areas to inspect and all those things. You know, we have a version of our class that's on NEHA's website that was put together for environmental health professionals. You don't have to be a member of NEHA, which is the National Environmental Health Association, but you do have to create a login, and that's free to do. You can take our class for free, and they're worth CEs, continuing education, 1 hour each for the 10 lessons. After we did that, we were contacted by, there's 2 national home inspector associations. I don't remember the names. One of those contacted us and wanted to use our class and charge their home inspectors for it. So I said no. The other one contacted us and said they'd like to offer this to their home inspectors. And they agreed that it would be free and nobody would make any money off of it. So I steered them to NEHA, and it turns out they already had a relationship with NEHA. So now there's that one association, their home inspectors can take those 10 classes and get credit for it to maintain their license, but they're also becoming much more informed, and that's who I would find. I would, you know, I wouldn't recommend buying a house without a home inspector in the first place that I paid for if I'm the one buying the home. And I would find one that has experience with private wells. So as far as testing, I'm not going to go through all the stuff on what we recommend testing for because we do this regularly. Both Is My Water Safe to Drink and Well Care 101, which we offer several times a year, several different months, have information in more detail about those things. So I encourage you to, if you either participate in the next one or go back and watch one of the videos from previous ones. Are there many possible water quality issues that can arise from there are from groundwater, no doubt. And to me, groundwater is one word. I should have changed that. Which of these should be tested for once and which should be tested for more frequently? This is a great question that no one has ever asked. I just know inherently what the answer here is, but I've never even thought of sharing that with anyone because no one's ever asked. So it's a great question. And what we recommend in those 2 videos I just mentioned, and they're down here below, are you test for coliform and nitrate annually. And that's because they're an indicator of a problem with your well. Testing for coliform and nitrate does not mean your well's safe from anything, like arsenic or PFAS or anything else. It's a way to say, I know my well's protected from surface contamination, because if you're like the example we just had with this cloudy water after a storm, that's going to have either elevated nitrate or bacteria in it, guaranteed. And so that's an annual test. It's fairly cheap, so that you can have peace of mind that nothing's happened. Weird things, like we had somebody with a tree near their well, and they were like, well, there's nothing near my well. And then they sent me a picture, and there's a giant tree within 2 feet. Well, it was a PVC well, and I guarantee you what happened is they kept having bacteria problems because the roots had got around the annulus and around that well and had squeezed it as it grew and cracked it. And so now you have all the bacteria around those tree roots that's getting into the well. So that's why you do the coliform and nitrate. But we also recommend inorganics and metals. And again, in those other webinars, we list what we think you should test for and what other things you should do to be sure you're covering what you need to for where you live. And we recommend doing that every 3 to 5 years. Just to know that your water chemistry hasn't changed. If it's a shallow aquifer, it changes a lot. If it's a deeper confined aquifer, really you should see most of metals and inorganics are fairly consistent. And if they're not, there's got to be a reason why. But for the other things like anthropogenic stuff, that man-made stuff like PFAS, pesticides, organics, which include oils and gas and all those things, first thing to do, and what I tell people, is you need to look at your risk. If you're in a place where there's a high risk of those things, then definitely it's worth doing it once. And I would say that for PFAS too, until I started getting into this question in the last couple of days. And so unless you have a potential source, it's not likely. And especially for pesticides, we see a lot of people who contact us and say, well, my subdivision backs up to a farm and my well is about 30 feet from this farm field where they grow corn and soybeans. Well, then it comes back to, where's your water coming from? If you have a shallow well, then yes, I would say that's more of a risk. If you have a well like in Champaign County where there's 2 aquitards and an aquifer between, the Muhammad aquifer, which is our deeper sand, and your well's properly constructed and grouted, then there's nearly 0 chance that a pesticide is getting down into that aquifer. In fact, when we sampled for ag chemicals in the deep Muhammad aquifer, it was the one place in Illinois where we found nitrate levels at background, which most of Illinois is farmed. Most of the time it's above 3 milligrams per liter for nitrate, which is considered background. Some places would say it's less than that, but we found it below that, where most of Illinois you're going to find it at least at 3, if not higher. So you need to be smart about it, because it is a lot of money for some of these things. And then all of that said, there's more and more information coming out about PFAS, and several articles and about the source being identified as our septic systems. So it's so ubiquitous and common in everything we do and use that it's getting into the ground through our septic systems. So considering, I think it's probably should be on the every 3 to 5 year list, whether you're near a source or not. Obviously, if you're near an airport or fire, like we're right next to a fire training facility. It's one of the best ones in the country. But if I had a well right here, I'd be concerned for PFAS for sure. So you need to determine your risk for most things, unless there's a buried tank, or there was, if you have that history, then you might want to test for organics. But again, it also comes down to where your water's coming from, how your well was constructed, some of those things. Even the stuff from your septic, or your on-site system, if PFAS is getting into the shallow groundwater, in Champaign County where I'm at, I still wouldn't recommend somebody test for PFAS unless they had some other information that suggested it could be there, because it's not likely to be in that aquifer, just because of the aquitards and the clay that separates a land surface from those things. Hopefully that helps. Okay, 3 o'clock, sorry. What are some pollution prevention strategies put in place for well construction? Well, there's certainly rules. Well construction there's a driller's code that licenses drillers. That's a protection. Requires certain kinds of materials, that they be grouted. You can use certain kind of pipe. All of those things are are in place in all but 2 states. 2 states don't have well construction code. And so that is probably the biggest thing. And, most will do what the state requires. And, those rules really do vary from state to state. Some have more leeway, some have specific rules for grouting. Some are, it's got to be a certain mixture or whatever. But then other things that can be done, like using potable water for drilling fluid, not just, I know back in the 90s, we did a lot of drilling, and I contracted a drilling firm. I was out putting monitoring wells in. We needed water, and the hole was going to cave in. So they put a contractor's pump in the local ditch and filled up their tank with that. That's not safe to put in a well. These were for water level monitoring. But it's just, you should use potable water with the drilling fluids and stuff so that you're not introducing anything that way. And, they have to disinfect after installation. I know in Illinois anyway, you've also got to, it's got to pass a test before they can release it to the owner. It's not very many things, but coliform nitrate, arsenic, and a couple other things, I think. So, and Sally found this, Minnesota Pollution Control Agency has this, it's about what to do with the wastewater from drilling, and it's really about preventing surface water contamination, and it's about having a tank to settle out stuff out of the water before you release it and things like that. But we put that URL here, and we can put that in the chat, or you can email us if you want that. But it's one of the things that, and she was searching for information on this particular question and found that from Minnesota. They do, yeah. Okay, we're not on site when wells are drilled, and we question the grouting method. I would like to know more about that process. So grout, we've talked about already. It's you fill the area between the hole that you've drilled for the well and the outside of the casing with a clay or cement barrier so that water from the surface can't go down along the well and actually get into the well eventually. So it's a thick liquid that seals everything up. It doesn't let water flow through. The annulus, which is that space, is called, and most states, again, have rules for that. So I was not sure. This question almost sounds like you're an inspector and you can't be on site when they're grouting and you're concerned that they're not doing things the right way. I would just ask the driller what their process is, make sure they're doing things or they can. But if you're really just asking for a way to help understand if they're not following the proper procedure, I really can't offer you any help there. Someone would just have to be on site. I mean, if the rules say it has to be done a certain way and you're concerned, then you need to go be there. There's no other alternative. Otherwise, I don't know of a way to understand whether it's grouted properly or not. After it's done, if they're supposed to grout the upper 80 feet and instead they're only grouting the upper 10 feet, there's no way to know that, that I know of. So complete the process of well creation from location to permits to disinfection to testing. I want to dig my own well. So why do you want to dig your own well? It's a really bad idea. If you're not licensed and you haven't been trained and you don't have the equipment, what ends up happening is people watch YouTube, they put in a well that's shallow, it's not protective, they put it in a place where it doesn't belong, where it's near other sources. And like in Illinois, you're allowed to drill your own well as long as you follow well code. Well, you're not going to put in a well in Illinois on your own property unless you have a rig, or you can rent one, which is going to cost you more money than the well. It's really just a bad idea if you're not experienced. It's a big investment, but it's also your family, and it's really just not something to mess with. It does it, I said here, it suggests you don't really understand the importance and value of your drinking water, especially if you're going to live there a long time. A lot of these things that are dangerous, like arsenic, it's drinking that over a period of many years that causes an increase in cancer risk. It's not worth it for a one-time thing. You want to do it properly and have it completed in a way that makes it safe. And it's why many states have outlawed sand points. And you can argue with people all the time. They can go to Farm and Fleet or one of the farm stores and buy for several $100s everything you need to put in a sand point. And you're pounding the ground with a sledgehammer, you get what you pay for. Anything, it's going to be a sandy area in the first place, which means there's a lot of infiltration. Everything's moving along the water table in a certain direction. Anything that happens up gradient is going to end up in your well. I wouldn't do it. It's just not worth it. As I mentioned before, there are a number of specific or detailed questions. I know there's one about having 9 connections. There was one about the rules for B systems in Washington State. Contact our help center with those. We're more than happy to do the legwork to help with that or get you the right person. I know in the case of the 9 connections and the distribution and that stuff, I would defer to one of the RCAP folks typically they're going to be licensed water operators who have a better idea of how to deal with that than we would. And so we can get you the right person. Yeah, and most of the time, if you ask about a specific state, I'm not going to answer it just because you may be the only person from that state on the webinar that day. And these are meant to be general, help people learn and expand what they learned by taking the class. And so if you haven't taken the class, that's the first thing to do. So more questions. It is 5 after, and I apologize for going long. It's become a standard thing for me, I realize. Let me find the questions. What did I do with them? There they are. Okay, so I'm going to pull this over and make it full screen. Regarding the question regarding the well casing material can be PVC, is there concern that the temperature difference during the summer and winter causes expansion and compression respectively? With that, the well cap should become loose and not provide a watertight seal. PVC is universally accepted by states. I'm not an expert on PVC, but I don't think that is an issue, mainly because the inside of your casing is going to be at the groundwater temperature, which, like in Illinois, our groundwater, if it's 90 degrees outside or if it's -5 degrees outside, the water in the well is going to be around 55 to 60 degrees. And so I'm sure that has some influence to stabilize that. I'm not saying that it won't get warm, but I don't think, PVC is, I won't say malleable, that's the wrong word, but it's not so rigid that if during a hot time, or I guess during a cold time, if you went out and snugged up things, that it would break it when it expanded, if it is. But I've not heard of that ever being an issue. The biggest issue with a cap is that you open it up, you don't replace all the bolts, you want it to be easier next time, or they're all rusted and some of the bolts are gone, or you've never replaced the little rubber gasket that goes in there, especially if you're in a winter situation. Most of the well caps I take off of a well, or take off, to get to the gasket, they're all brittle, broken, and they've been there forever. It should be a best practice that every couple of years you change the well gasket, the gasket on your well cap, because that's the, it's that you've seen an old rubber gasket before that's been sitting for 10 years on the shelf. You can snap it in two, and that's what happens. And so that's probably as important. What will be the minimum distance a water well will have from an underground injection facility as a septic tank? That's a state question. Every state has rules. There's actually a lot more rules for on-site septic systems than there are for wells, as far as how they're regulated, how they can be installed, all that stuff. I would talk to your local or county inspector. Like in Illinois, that's a county health department, or the state health department, or the state resource agency that has jurisdiction over septic tanks. Because that some states won't have any rule for that particular thing necessarily, or they may treat it as something else. Others may have an exact rule that says it's a given number of feet. When you go through the class, I use an example from Minnesota for what's in their well code, and it lists about 50 different things that all have a setback distance from a well. But I don't believe an underground injection facility as a septic tank. Yeah, I don't know how to help you there. I would talk to someone in your state or your local jurisdiction. All right, thank you for staying. Again, if you need CEs or need a certificate, all those things, go to info@privatewellclass.org as an email address. You will get an email from me in about an hour or two, and you can wait till then. Especially if anybody wants to have an assessment done, well, you can even go to our help center and talk to Sally or Aaron, or Katie helps with that as well. And yeah, thank you for attending. Everybody have a great day.